Bobby Rink, I want to welcome you to Evening Upstairs at your library. Born and raised in Paducah, buried in Oak Grove Cemetery, John Scopes gained national recognition as the defendant in the famous monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee. Join us tonight as our speaker discusses Scopes' legacy and life. Our speaker is WKMS producer and award-winning documentarian. Let's welcome Todd Hatton as he presents a look at this most remarkable Paducah.
First, I would really like to thank the McCracken County Public Library for allowing me to come up here and speak with all of you about John Scopes, and certainly for the help and support they have given to WKMS News documentaries over the past few years, Bobby Wrinkle, Nathan Lynn, and Matt Yeager in particular. To begin with, and I'm going to see if I can figure this out, 2 buttons, it shouldn't be too bad. It's important to mention that most of what people today understand about the 1925 monkey trial, and by extension John Scopes, comes from one source of rather dubious veracity. The 1960 Stanley Kramer film Inherit the Wind, wherein Father Flanagan and Dr. Jekyll debate creation and evolution in a trial overseen by Colonel Sherman T. Potter. The defendant in the trial is, of course, Darren from Bewitched. Now, the reality is a little bit different. One of the main questions is, does a 90-year-old trial surrounded by unprecedented levels of hype really matter today? And even if it does, why should anyone bother with the defendant who barely said a word during the trial and who virtually disappeared from the spotlight immediately afterward? Now, obviously, we all have our own answers to those questions, and I dare say that we consider this significant for one reason or another, otherwise we wouldn't be here. But allow me to suggest that the trial was significant because it brought the contention between evolution and creationism, or religion and science if you prefer, out to the universities and seminaries and into the public sphere, inviting us not only to have an opinion, but to share it. It was, after all, the first trial of the century to be broadcast live on national media, on WGN. In fact, some of these photographs from the trial, you might notice a small wooden plinth, and on top is this dinner plate-sized microphone, flagged with WGN. But it would provide a cultural, if not legal, precedent for those who would later rise to challenge anti-evolution laws across the United States, beginning in the late 60s with Epperson v. Arkansas, and lasting into the present as recently as 2005 in Kitzmiller v. Dover Board of Education. In all of these cases, and in all of the State House debates over academic freedom bills, and I put that in quotes, we continually see references back to the symbol of this 1925 Dayton trial. This is Kentucky's, not an anti-evolution law, this is their academic freedom bill that's been on the books since 1990. If you can't read that, very quickly, in any public school, instruction concerning the theories of creation of man and the earth, which involves the theory thereon commonly known as evolution, any teacher so desiring may include as a portion of such instruction the theory of creation presented in the Bible, and may accordingly read such passages in the Bible as are deemed necessary for instruction on the theory of creation, thereby affording students the choice as to which theory to accept. And no teacher in a public school may stress any particular denominational religious belief. Again, that was repealed and reenacted in July of 1990. We continually see references back to the symbol of this 1925 trial and all of these things. The man without whom this trial would not have happened. John Thomas Scopes of Paducah, Kentucky. Now that's why the monkey trial matters. And that's why, significantly for us, John Scopes matters. But let's face it, John gets overlooked in history a lot, actually. And it started early. In Dr. Ed Larson's 1998 book, Summer for the Gods, which won a deserved Pulitzer Prize and is as close to one-stop shopping for information about the Scopes trial as you can possibly get, Dr. Larson writes, in marked contrast to William Jennings Bryan's reception, the New York defense attorneys arrived without fanfare. Unknown and unannounced, one reporter noted, the little group passed quietly through the station to Dr. Rapplier's car. That's George Rapplier, who was instrumental in Dayton for instigating the trial. The only excitement occurred after their arrival in Dayton. Charles Francis Potter, who accompanied Dudley Field Malone and Arthur Garfield Hayes, two defense attorneys on the trip, became alarmed when a young man grabbed their baggage out of the open trunk. Hey boy, what are you doing there with those suitcases? Potter shouted. That's all right, Doc, Rapplier replied. That's only Scopes. The defenders, along with everyone else, had forgotten the defendant. Now, I had the opportunity last year in Dayton, Tennessee, to interview Dr. Ed Larson. He graciously consented to speak to me. We had breakfast and went to the Ray County Courthouse and conducted the interview, part of which you will hear when this documentary finally airs. But before I went to interview him, I wanted to do a little bit of research about the guy. It's just what you do in my line of work. And I caught an interview that he did on C-SPAN's Book Notes program in 1998, not long after he had won the Pulitzer. And the interviewer, about halfway through, finally gets around to asking about John Scopes. Tell me about John Scopes. And Dr. Larson, Pulitzer Prize winner, said, well, he was a school teacher from Illinois. I about put the remote to the TV. Now, this might lead an otherwise reasonable person to ask, so what? What does it matter where he came from? Which is, to me, a bit like investigating a mysterious fire and not really being the least bit curious as to who said it or why. To describe John Scopes as a school teacher from Illinois paints a picture of the young man as a Midwesterner with the associated culture and values, but he wasn't. He was a Southerner. He described himself that way. He never considered anywhere but Paducah his hometown. And on his mother's side, his Western Kentucky roots run very, very deep. And he was all the more unique, taking the long look, because of that. So unique, in fact, that this shy, retiring young man of, why did it do this? There we are. So unique, in fact, that the shy, retiring young man of 24 volunteered to be the defendant in a trial designed to bring attention to the town of Dayton, Tennessee, and by extension to himself, whether he liked it or not. So why did he do it? In my opinion, the answer lies, as it does for many of us, in his parents. My parents are here, so I've got to step very gingerly. Thomas and Mary Alva Scopes. Now, let's see. Here we are. Thomas Scopes is the man sitting to John's left, the man who looks eerily like him. It was taken on the front porch. This is a photo from 1925. This was taken on the front porch of the W.C. Bailey boarding house in Dayton, Tennessee. The house is still there. It is, appropriately enough now, a lawyer's office. Of his parents, Thomas was arguably the more influential on John. John was the fifth of their 5 children, the youngest, and their only son. Thomas was born in London in 1860. He immigrated to the U.S. in 1882. He came from a poor background, and despite the fact that he was a very smart kid, he only managed the equivalent of an 8th grade formal education. But the family had a friend with an extensive library who opened it up to young Thomas, who took full advantage of it and became a voracious reader. Now, I've had the opportunity to speak to Jim Presley, who co-wrote, or rather collaborated with John Scopes on the book Center of the Storm. I've also had the privilege of speaking to John Scopes Jr. and Bill Scopes, John's 2 sons. And all 3 of them used that phrase, voracious reader. Thomas was, John Sr. was, and actually John Jr. and Bill are as well. And Bill's son, Richie, who is a physicist, is as well. That was a trait that he passed along, as I said, to his children, not just John, all of his children. In his teenage years, Thomas trained to be a machinist, and he decided to come to the United States to seek his fortune. He landed in Philadelphia in 1882, and he was unusual in the respect that he had in his possession 4 books, which this is a time when books are not cheap. They can be had, but they are often outside of the income that Thomas was accustomed to. It was an eclectic selection. 2 of the books were gifts from his mother. One was the King James Version of the Bible, because he grew up C of E, Church of England, and the Church of England hymnal. The 3rd book was Thomas Carlyle's The French Revolution, which I can attest is not light reading. And the 4th book, does anybody want to guess what that 4th book might have been? Now you might know, Dr. Rupa.
I'm going to hope Origin of Species.
And you're correct. It was Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. Let us all take a moment to savor the irony. Now, Thomas found work in the booming railroad industry, and that's how he found himself in Union City, Tennessee in the late 1880s. And that is where he met his Western Kentucky belle, Mary Alva Brown. She was about as close as you can get to Cumberland Presbyterian royalty. Her father, one of her grandfathers, was a Reverend Calvert, who was instrumental in founding quite a number of Cumberland Presbyterian churches in the area. Now, John wrote in Center of the Storm that next to Clarence Darrow, his father Thomas was the best well-read man he knew. He read to the children before they started school, not only from Carlyle and Darwin, but from Shakespeare and Twain and Dickens. And when the children learned to read and started school, he would quiz them on what they had learned. And they grew up knowing that learning was both important and a continuing process. Now, working on the railroad, Thomas became active in the labor movement and later in his life in socialist politics. And it's important to note that socialism back then did not have the same baggage that it has now. It had baggage, but it was different baggage. And that's certainly not to say that religion was not important to him. As I said, Thomas was raised Church of England, and he joined the Presbyterian Church when he married Mary Alva. And one of the main things he taught his children was the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. He also reinforced in them the idea that you should judge a person less on what they believe and more on what they actually do. And according to John, Thomas would say, I believe God is love and love is God, and I try to live a life of love. Let me give you an example. In the first decade of the 20th century, Thomas was an elder of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church here in Paducah, just a couple blocks that way. At the time, the other elders went on a crusade to shut down the red light district and run the prostitutes out of town. We all know why Maiden Alley is called Maiden Alley, right? Okay. John writes that when the elders met, Thomas was shocked at their holier-than-thou attitude. He'd always thought Christianity meant love and charity and justice for others, no matter who they were. And he thought others believed the same way. And again, let me quote John Scopes directly. Now, as they equated Christianity with running the whores out of town, his mind balked. Well, Dad said angrily, what are you going to do about these girls? Are you going to ship them to Mayfield or somewhere else in Kentucky? Or are you going to run them over to Cairo in Illinois? And if you do, have you talked to the people in those towns? Do they want these girls there? Have you thought about what's going to happen to the girls when you get rid of them? Why don't we find a place in our society for these wayward girls instead of running them out of town? They deserve to live, and they have to eat just as we do. Any true Christian would be filled with compassion for them and their degradation. Driving them out of town won't solve their problem, nor ours. It won't raise the morality of Paducah. They wouldn't be here as prostitutes in the first place if the men of Paducah hadn't patronized them. John writes his sermon failed to stop their program to revamp Paducah morally, and he left the church never to belong to another one the rest of his life. And John inherited Thomas's view of spirituality. When the family lived in Salem, Illinois, they moved there in 1915 from Danville, where they had moved in 1913 from Paducah. John attended Sunday school and church services, even though he wasn't a member. The acting minister who taught the young men's Bible class was the vice president of a local manufacturing company. And on one Sunday morning, he used a recent business trip to Chicago to illustrate the lesson. since John tells it best, I'll leave it to him. Quote, he described the evidences he had seen of the sinful pleasures of the big city. At his hotel, he'd been pestered by a bellhop who kept asking him, would you like some company for the night, sir? He told of young men and women pairing off to indulge in the sinful pleasures of the flesh. The boys leaned forward, ears straining, and eyes following every gesture. I could hear the boy next to me swallow. The minister, by recounting his experiences and observations, pretended to warn us of the pitfalls of the big city so as to protect us. Surely he knew better. He was doing the opposite. Within minutes, every boy there had his mind on copulation. Not one could have walked out of the room without embarrassment. And when I could stand his talk no longer, I said, you're making these boys think that's the way life is in the big city. If you ask me, I think the whole talk is hypocritical. The minister's face told me I had hit the mark. His lips pinched together. You've willfully misinterpreted what I've said. Twisted every word. The Sunday school class ended in a hell of an uproar. I climaxed the argument by leaving the room. I never returned to that church. Now, before you think I'm forgetting John's mother, I need to mention that if nothing else, he learned something quite important from Mary Alva as well. For all Thomas did, and for all he was involved in, and he was very active, even after he retired, she once told John, do you think your father could do all of that if I wasn't standing with him and supporting him? In other words, behind every good man is an equally good, if not more so, woman. Here endeth the lesson, right? But let me catch up to where we are in terms of where they are. They're in Salem, Illinois in 1915, and it's done it again. Dang nabbit. Is there a way I can stop that? Pull the jump drive out. Okay. Let's see if that works. As long as nothing catches fire, I think we're fine. By this point, by the time he graduates high school from Salem High School in 1919, they have lived in Danville, Illinois. He was born, John Scopes was born August 3rd, 1900. They were living at number 4 Mayfield Gravel Road. Since Thomas was a machinist, it made perfect sense. It's right across the street from the VMV yards, well, the Illinois Central yards at the time. But Thomas, rather, I'm going to do this a lot, Thomas, rather, didn't like living in the city. So as soon as he could, he moved out to the country. Well, Burger Road. At the time, that was out in the country. I should know, my grandfather once got stuck in their front yard. And they owned property on Burger Road until, I suppose, the mid-50s. They would move from Paducah in 1913, when John was 13, to Danville, Illinois, and then to Salem. The family then moved back in either, if I'm not mistaken, 1919 or 1920, back to Burger Road, and they stayed there. Scopes was living there until at least 1955, when I believe his mother died. Past that, let me get caught up here. And as far as I can recall from oral history interviews, John went to Avondale Elementary School, which, if I'm not mistaken, is up where Paducah Middle School is now. Okay, good, people are nodding, good. Moved when he was 13 to Danville, then to Salem. And in 1919, the fall of 1919, John started at the University of Illinois at Urbana. It was not Champaign-Urbana, it was just Urbana at the time. He was a chemistry major and lasted 1 year there. He had to quit because of severe bronchitis that was brought about by the chemicals he was exposed to. But John had worked so hard and so well that they gave him the credit. They excused him from the final exams and let him go home. Home at that point was not Paducah, it was still Salem, although the family was getting ready to move back to Paducah. And so John took it upon himself to finish his education at the University of Kentucky. And I have asked Jim and John Jr. and Bill if that meant that he was a UK fan. None of them gave me a satisfactory answer. Because I'm not sure that the basketball team existed at that point. I know a couple people in here could probably correct me. There's the other one, and there's one. He got into his senior year, 1923-1924 academic year. His father had told him, take the professor, not the class. And those of you who may have had experience with academic advising might consider that as an absolute nightmare, because he's not following a curriculum necessarily. So he enters his senior year at UK without a major. He's never had one. So what he does is, in a replay of his first year at the University of Illinois, he almost kills himself completing a Bachelor of Arts in Law, because he was considering becoming a lawyer, returning to Paducah and practicing law. Well, 1924, he graduates the University of Kentucky. He says, well, you know, I kind of need to rebuild my finances. So he puts his name on a directory that schools in Kentucky and Tennessee can draw from. And next thing you know, he gets a job offer from Ray County High School in Dayton, Tennessee. And he took it. Now, I do have an oral history interview from Leela Scopes that was done about 25 years ago, where she basically says that they offered her the job and that she saw John moping around the house and said, no, you take it. And actually, I think she's misremembering it, because Ray County High School was looking to fill one position that was a part-time science teacher and football coach. I don't know many female football coaches today, and I hazard to guess they were even more rare in 1925. So with all due respect to Leila Scopes, I think that she's just misremembered it. Now I'm going to skip over the trial right now, because we all have a rough familiarity with it, and get to some of the other stuff that you may not know. First of all, I'm sure you're probably, I've always been kind of amazed at the level of academic work that John Scopes did. But then Bill Scopes told me last week that, well, of course Dad could do it. He was smart. He had a 167 IQ. That surprised me too. And he really intended to drop out of sight after the trial. His father had always impressed upon him the importance of being his own man. Never let anybody else define you. Live the life you want to live. And what he saw during these 3 months in Dayton, Tennessee didn't turn out to be what he wanted to do. In fact, after the trial, he went back to the University of Kentucky, still considering going to UK law. And the president of the university said, by all means, you could be another Clarence Darrow. And that was the absolute wrong thing to say to John. He didn't want to be Clarence Darrow. He wanted to be John Scopes. So regretfully, he abandoned his pursuit of a law degree and went to his second love, geology. He went to work for Gulf Oil of South America from 1927 until 1930. He worked in Venezuela and Colombia, back when there were still headhunters out in the jungles that they were traversing to lay pipeline. And while he was in Venezuela, he met and married his wife, Mildred Walker of South Carolina. He called her a pretty little brown-eyed brunette. Her father was a construction contractor in Venezuela at the time. She was a dyed-in-the-wool Roman Catholic, so that's where he joined the church. And I hazard to guess, Venezuela being Venezuela at the time, that may have been the only way he could have gotten married to her. That was in February of 1930 that they got married. And I have a picture further back. In September of 1930, they went to Chicago for a year of study in geology. While there, they were frequent guests, overnight and dinner guests of the Darrows. He and Clarence Darrow were close friends until Darrow passed away. They then, upon completing his studies, they moved back to Paducah. It was the middle of the Depression. It's 1931, and he does not have a job. So he and Mildred move in with Thomas and Mary Alva, and I don't know that Leela was living there at the time. And it was there that his first son, John Thomas Scopes Jr., was born in the fall of 1932. I believe John says it was right around the time of the start of the World Series. In the summer of 1933, he went to work for the United Gas Corporation. He started in Beeville, Texas, and John Jr. tells me the story that they gave him the job, but they told him he would have to wait until the man who had it died. Apparently, the gentleman, the geologist that was there in Beeville, was terminally ill. And so they, within a few months, the job was unfortunately open, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it. He eventually moved to UGC's home office in 1934. His second son, William Scopes, was born in Houston in 1935. And John moved to Shreveport, Louisiana in 1940 when United Gas moved their headquarters there. He retired in 1964. And passed away on October 21st from esophageal cancer. I said October 21st, 1970, in Shreveport, Louisiana. The funeral was at St. John's on Jourdain Road, and then his wife Mildred brought him home, where he rests in Oak Grove Cemetery right now. And those are the vital statistics. That's the hard and fast information, shorn more or less of the context of the next thing to talk about. This is the family in 1935, Mildred, and of course, John Jr. A little bit more gray, John is these days, but looks fairly similar. Although, if you catch him in the right way, John Jr. is a little heavier than John Sr. ever was. But you catch him the right way, and it almost takes your breath away. You're almost looking at John Scopes. Not surprisingly, but it's a little eerie sometimes. This is John in 1960, a publicity photo that was taken when his wife, Stanley Kramer, convinced Mildred to convince him to come out and do publicity work for Inherit the Wind. Jerome Lawrence and Robert E. Lee, not that Robert E. Lee, who wrote the play Inherit the Wind, had tried to get John involved. They offered him tickets to the Broadway premiere, and John said, no thank you. He actually gave them to John Jr. and his girlfriend. They went and met everybody backstage and all had a great time. July, I believe 25th, 1960. That was the day, that was John T. Scopes Day in Dayton, Tennessee. The world premiere of Inherit the Wind was at the Berlin Film Festival in early 1960. The United States premiere of Inherit the Wind was July 25th, 1960 in the Ray County Drive-In in Dayton, Tennessee. They had a big to-do. Everybody that was involved in the trial and was still alive came. I do not believe one of the lawyers was still alive. One of the Hicks brothers was still alive. But he was unable to come. So it was basically John and the bailiff. And they gave him the key to the city and had a big parade down the main street. And then everybody got in their cars and drove over to the Ray County Drive-In and watched the movie. And after the movie, Stanley Kramer was asking around, well, what did you think? Did you like it? Did you like it? And everybody was like, it was nice. Now, years later, they'll tell you, hated it. Absolutely. This wasn't our history. Well, no, it wasn't. Because Inherit the Wind, if you read the preface to the play, Jerome Lawrence and Robert E. Lee say that the play is well, it was written at the same time as plays like The Crucible. It was an analogy for McCarthyism. A story about persecution, not a documentary. That comes later. Let's see. What's the next one we got? This is John in 1965. It seems as though, whether he liked it or not, reporters came knocking on his door every 10 years. 1935, 1945, 1955, and 1965. This was, of course, after Inherit the Wind. John had retired by this point. This is a still, actually, from one of the few pieces of video that I've ever been able to find. I know that he did the Today Show in 1965. This is actually from a Canadian television show on the CBC. It was the same kind of show that we used to have here in the U.S., where you have a panel of columnists and the host, and they guess who the mystery guest is going to be, and eventually the mystery host just gets tired of it and brings the guest on and they interview him. Well, that's the same deal here. And that's actually where I finally got to hear at long last John Scopes' voice. And working in radio and making these kinds of documentaries, you worry about stuff like that. I mean, what does he sound like? Because since there's not a lot of audio out there floating around, in order to get more of the information out in his voice, I have to find someone who's going to kind of sort of sound like him. And so I was great trepidation when he opened his mouth. When he did open his mouth, I found out that you can take the boy out of Western Kentucky, but you cannot take Western Kentucky out the boy. His speech pattern sounds like it came from out in the county. I mean, and I grinned so big because it was nice to hear that tone of voice. And so I was able to figure out who will voice John Scopes when he's not voicing himself in the documentary. Nathan Lynn. It's going to be Nathan Lynn, who's agreed to do it, thankfully. This is a publicity photograph from 1967 when he was doing publicity for Center of the Storm, the book that he collaborated with. It's a memoir. He collaborated with Texarkana, Texas journalist James Presley, who is still working today and doesn't have a bad word to say about John Scopes. They became very, very good friends. They met in '64, I believe, right as John was retiring, at a party. And John liked to tell people that he barely remembered the party. He was so in the back. But John and Jim formed a very, very close relationship to the point where it was 2 or 3 years until Jim finally said, you should write a book. And John said, well, if you'll do it with me, I'll do it. And later on, there was someone wanted to use a portion of the book, and so this was going to be a copyright thing. There was going to be money involved. They asked Jim, and he said, well, sure, because struggling reporter needed the money. And John's answer, anything for Jim. There's a great picture that was in Life magazine taken about this time, and it's taken in the backyard of John Scopes' house in Shreveport on Moss Point Road, which is a beautiful neighborhood, very rural. His backyard went into a lake. He would go out there most mornings and fish. And it's late in the year, and he's standing there in a flannel jacket, grinning, and standing next to him is a very young Jim Presley, who is obviously blown away by the fact that here he is with an honest-to-goodness historical figure. This is the last picture, public picture, taken of John Scopes. This was taken April 1st, 1970. He would be dead 6 months and 20 days later. This was taken when John appeared at Peabody College, now the Peabody College of Education at Vanderbilt University. The men he's talking to, let me see if I can get their names. Well, I can tell you right now that these two gentlemen were the two Tennessee state lawmakers who were instrumental in the repeal of the Butler Act in 1968. So at least John lived to see the Butler Act go away. He actually lived to see the Supreme Court case of Epperson v. Arkansas decided. That is the Supreme Court decision that basically invalidated anti-evolution laws throughout the United States. There's another photograph that was in a magazine published by Peabody, or the Vanderbilt Alumni Association, where John, it's taken from behind, he's at the podium, crowd's out in front of him, try to see if I can recreate it for you, and he's just standing there like this, just looking back. And this guy has obviously got the crowd in the palm of his hand. He was the kind of guy that could nothing fazed him. And it's not surprising. I mean, 3 months in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925 made sure that nothing would ever faze him. This is St. John's in Shreveport, Louisiana. I took a picture last week. This is where the funeral was held. And if I'm not mistaken, from what John Jr. told me, this is where the family, this is where Mildred and the kids went to Mass. I think that John Scopes was only ever in a Catholic church twice in his life, if you get married and at his funeral. And in fact, the Roman Catholic Church is the only church that John T. Scopes was ever officially affiliated with. That surprises a few people. I mean, he was raised Presbyterian, went to Presbyterian Church in Dayton, Tennessee. And this, of course, is his headstone over in Oak Grove. Now, I've always been curious because what's written right here, I have a pointer, a man of courage, right there. And I've always wondered, because it looks like it's an addition, who added it? I asked John Jr., I asked Bill, I asked Jim. The consensus is Leela. Leela put it there for brother, was what she called him. That she honestly did believe that, because Leela and John, two peas in a pod. They were the siblings that were closest together in age, and she made sacrifices for him here in Paducah, as a matter of fact. She was essentially deprived of her job teaching mathematics at Augusta Tillman by people who didn't exactly much cotton to what her brother was doing down in Dayton, which wasn't really actually that much. So they made her decide, which side of this do you fall on? And she said, well, I reckon I'll go with brother. And that was that. Of course, he's buried there with his wife. And here we go. Here's the trial. In 1925, March. Let's see. Let me get caught up here. This man, Tennessee Governor Austin Peay, who has a state university named after him. Let's all savor that irony. Signed this bill into law. Tennessee Code Annotated Title 49, Education, Section 1922, better known as the Butler Act. And this is the relevant portion. It shall be unlawful for any teacher in any of the universities, normals, and all other public schools of the state, which are supported in whole or in part by the public school funds of the state, to teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. I don't know what that is. That's not necessarily evolution, though. But that's what it bans specifically, human evolution. You could teach that cows evolved from platypuses. You could not teach that man evolved from an earlier form. This is the man responsible, sitting next to his hero, William Jennings Bryan. This is John Washington Butler, this gentleman right here. And despite the fact that he looks like he just ate a lemon, the anecdotal stories say he was a very warm guy, very nice guy, very pleasant, no matter who you were. Even if you were Clarence Darrow, he was nice to you. But he always looks a little pinched there. Butler was a farmer. He was a part-time teacher, school teacher, not Sunday school, just regular school teacher from Macon County, Tennessee, which is just across the state line from Allen County, Kentucky. And either way, the passage of the Butler Act prompted the American Civil Liberties Union to place ads in the major newspapers across Tennessee stating that they would represent for free any teacher that was willing to stand for a test case of the Butler Act. The manager of a mining operation in Dayton, Tennessee, George Rapelier, who was there to basically oversee the bankruptcy liquidation, thought this would be a great way to get publicity for Dayton. Dayton was about 1,800 people at the time, down from, I think it was close to 5,000 at the turn of the century, thanks to the iron and coal mining that was going on throughout the area. It was a very cosmopolitan town, 2 Catholic churches, one for the Irish, the other for the Polish. A private school, private girls' school, and as you can see, a very thriving. This is actually Market Street. From the perspective that you're standing at, the train station, big train station, is behind you. Of course, by the time this picture was taken, the train no longer stopped in Dayton. It just went right on through, unless it had a specific reason to stop, like mail. Now, the City Fathers bought into this idea because he thought this would be a great way to drum up publicity, as I said. And that brings us here, Main Street in Dayton, or Market Street. Specifically, it takes us here. This is F.E. Robinson's drugstore, as you can probably tell from the sign. And here we are inside the drugstore. It's here that the City Fathers met on May 5th, 1925. And they decided that, well, yeah, this would be a great idea, but we can't ask the regular science teacher to do it. Sorry, we just can't. Why? He was the school principal. He had a family. He was a pillar of the community. So they couldn't throw him under the bus. Well, then who were we going to get to do it? Well, we have this contract teacher who he coaches football. He teaches a little bit of science. We'll get him to do it. So Robinson sticks his head out the door and sees a kid playing in the street and says, "Go find me John Scopes, I want to talk to him." Kid says, "Okay," drops his marbles and goes to find him. And finds him here at Central High School. It's no longer there. It's now a vacant lot behind the YMCA today. John was playing tennis. And the kid waited until they finished the point. And because there's no great sense of urgency, and said, Mr. Robinson wants to come talk to you. John said, fine, finish the set. Didn't change his clothes, nothing. And I have to mention that it was hot in Dayton that spring and in that summer. Hot in a way that I know only another town on the Tennessee River can appreciate. Because Dayton is a stone's throw from the Tennessee. So he waltzes over to the drugstore, opens the door, and he finds these gentlemen. Now these gentlemen, this is actually a staged photograph, the title being How It All Started. And this was taken not long before the trial. And I will do my level best to point out the appropriate people here. And of course, this is John sitting in the middle. The gentleman standing to his left is George Rapelier. This is, let's see, we'll start right here. This is Justice of the Peace, J.M. Willier. W.C. Haggard. Mr. W.F. Morgan. And this gentleman here is an attorney. This is his brother. This is, you'd think I'd have this. H.E. Hicks is this gentleman. This is S.K. Hicks. You all know who he is. You may not know you know, but you know. S.K. Hicks was born, when S.K. Hicks was born, his mother died during childbirth. So he was named for his mother. His first name is Sue. And later on, when Shel Silverstein heard that, he thought that was great and wrote this nice little ditty called A Boy Named Sue. And later on, Johnny Cash got a hold of it. And ended up, S.K. and Johnny Cash were great friends, all thanks to the fact that he later became a judge, which is why he was unavailable for the John T. Scopes Day. And of course, the gentleman here, that's F.E. Robinson himself, the owner of the store. That's the Hicks brother, John, George, Paul, Ringo, let's see. Sorry. This is Ray County School Superintendent Walter White. Insert your pop culture jokes here. And this gentleman here is Ray County County Judge, J.G. McKenzie. Very hot spring, very hot summer. So they offer John a Coke from the fountain. And they asked him if he would be willing to be the defendant in this test case. And John said, well, if you can prove I taught it, I'll do it. And he's not being snotty. He didn't really remember. And you'll read in some places that he later said he didn't teach it. He knew definitively he didn't teach it. And that's what Bill Scopes will tell you. Jim and John Jr., however, will say he wasn't ever really sure. In fact, depending on which article you read at which point in the chronology, he was never very sure whether he taught it or not. But he was so adamantly opposed to the law that he was willing to stand for it. And in fact, Clarence Darrow had to do a little bit of tap dancing in order to make sure that witnesses would not perjure themselves. A prime example being Luke Morgan, his home in Dayton, Tennessee, now a vacant lot. That's where Clarence Darrow and his wife Ruby stayed during the trial. Luke had a son named Howard Morgan, who was one of the prosecution witnesses and a student of John Scopes. So, in order to avoid suborning perjury, Clarence Darrow called a taxi cab. Taxi cab pulls up, he gets in, Howard Morgan gets in, John Scopes gets in, and they drive around Dayton, Tennessee, while John Scopes teaches the boy the theory of evolution. So that when he got on the stand, the Attorney General of the state of Tennessee, was prosecuting attorney Tom Stewart, later a U.S. Senator, asked the boy, did John Scopes teach you the theory of evolution? And the boy could truthfully say, yes. Well, what did he teach you? And the boy could describe it. Tom Stewart never asked where he taught him, just that he taught him. It's a very near miss. Now, after this, after they go back to the back of the store, and you'll notice right here, it's bookshelves. Back then, school books for high school worked kind of like college textbooks today. You bought it and you owned it. So you could pass it down to a younger sibling who may be a year or two behind you, as opposed to today where they issue a textbook and you give it back when it's over. He said, well, can you go get me the textbook? So they go get George Hunter's A Civic Biology. And they turn to the relevant page, 194. And right there it is, the doctrine of evolution. George Hunter is a civic biology. It may sound like a strange name, but George Hunter was believed that science could improve society. George Hunter was also a eugenicist. Of course, and this is back before eugenics acquired its darker connotation. Back then, if they wanted to keep you from continuing to foul the gene pool, they just sterilized you. You may have been an imbecile, which essentially means you're functional, but you're retarded, mentally challenged. Or perhaps you, like a child with Down syndrome. They might sterilize that child, but they certainly wouldn't kill him. They're not savages. It was the Nazis who would turn that into the dark connotation that it has today. I mean, when you consider that Oliver Wendell Holmes was a supporter of eugenics. This is, of course, let's understand this in the context of the time. This is a time where they thought that given the continual advances of science, there wasn't anything science couldn't do to improve society. Well, that may not always be the case. You have to have a healthy dose of scientific ethics to go with it. So they flip through it, they find this and says, well, if it's in the book, then I taught it. State regulation. You got to teach what's in a book. You can't skip anything. You start at the beginning, you end at the end. So Scopes said he would do it. F.E. Robinson, got on the phone to the Chattanooga News to let them know that they had arrested a young man for teaching evolution in Rhea County High School. George Rapelier got an arrest warrant from the sheriff. The town constable arrested John Scopes. And then John finished his fountain drink and went back to playing tennis. Now, it's important to mention, and I mention this because we all remember that scene in Inherit the Wind. Bertram T. Cates, at least they got that right, is in his jail cell with the howling mob outside talking to his fiancée. None of which happened. The violation of the Butler Act was a misdemeanor, meaning is essentially a speeding ticket. Of course, I say this and I notice there are a lot of lawyers in the room, so I may be misstating it, so feel free to thump me if I'm wrong. But I mean, it was certainly a misdemeanor. Punishable by a fine of not less than $100 and not more than $500 to be assessed by the jury. In 2014 dollars, that works out low end $1,300, high end about $6,700. To give you an idea of how much that would impact a person's income, especially if you're a poor contract school teacher in Dayton, Tennessee. So the case is set in motion. And then the players start arriving. There is William Jennings Bryant arriving in town. And bear in mind, the arrest was the 5th of May. The verdict was the 25th of July, maybe a day or two off. The trial lasted 8 days, and it included a weekend. And it's over. Let's see. This is the judge, in the case, Judge John Ralston, who looks nothing like Sherman Potter. His wife and his 2 daughters, they're standing beside the Hotel Aqua. Hotel Aqua, well, actually, let me see. That street does not look like that today. In fact, I have a picture of it a little later on, if we have the time. I know we're running up on it. But most of these buildings are gone. That's gone. It's marked. The place where it was is marked, but it's gone. That's gone. The Hotel Aqua is gone. This is the arrival of Clarence Darrow. That's Darrow right there. And that's John. That is John Neil Randolph, who was John's first attorney. Came up to him one day in the street and said, hello, my name is John Neil Randolph. I'm a law professor at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and I'm your lawyer whether you like it or not. But once the ACLU stepped in, they brought in Dudley Field Malone. Is anybody familiar with F. Lee Bailey? Remember him? Okay. Dudley Field Malone was the F. Lee Bailey of the mid-1920s. That's how prominent he was, internationally known divorce attorney. The other lawyer was Arthur Garfield Hayes, who was one of the co-founders of the American Civil Liberties Union. And of course, Clarence Darrow. They didn't want Clarence Darrow. Clarence Darrow was they thought he was a little sleazy. He had just come off the Leopold and Loeb trial, which was 2 young child thrill killers, and he had gotten them. He didn't get them off, but he helped them avoid the gas chamber. But John knew, because he'd lived in Dayton for a year, he was familiar with the South, and he knew that any legal battle was going to be a down-in-the-mud affair. I believe that those were his exact words. So he wanted to fight her. And eventually the higher-ups of the ACLU said, "Who's your lawyer?" He said, "Clarence Darrow." That's why Darrow was there. That's how he got there. That's how he stayed there. John doesn't make that decision. Darrow's not there. Darrow never debates Brian. There's Dudley Field Malone. This is Arthur Garfield Hayes. I don't know who this gentleman is, but that's, of course, John and Clarence Darrow. This is an article from Liberty Magazine, a contemporary article. Of course, we see Austin Peay, George Rapelier, the obligatory picture of Charles Darwin, John Scopes. On the next page, this is the jury. Of course, William Jennings Bryan. And this is actually a photo from the trial. And you can see the microphone right there. And no, there are no extant recordings from the trial itself. Believe me, I have looked. I talked to a very annoyed engineer in Chicago about it. This is Darrow's last statement to the jury before they go into recess to deliberate. This is Ralston reading the verdict. Now, Ralston asked the jury, how much of a fine do you want to assess? The jury says, you decide. This gave the grounds for the appeal, and actually that's why the Tennessee State Supreme Court threw out the case and vacated the verdict. Not for any other reason. Of course, they did go to a little bit of an extreme to the extent of saying, no, this really is a constitutional law. But then, yes, it's also invalid because they screwed up the assessment of the fine. This is a letter that is hanging in John Scopes Jr.'s house. This is a letter from the Battle House in Mobile, Alabama, to John Scopes Sr. from Clarence Darrow, kind of filling him in on what's going on in the appeal. Basically telling him, case is pretty much dead, we'll see what we can do. But don't hold your breath, kid. Now, this is the big climax that everybody remembers today, even though this is not actually the climax of the trial. That actually came the Friday previous, when William Jennings Bryan had basically cast aspersions on the defense team for being unchristian in their approach. And Dudley Field Malone, who a devout Roman Catholic, took a great deal of exception. And he stood up and made a 20-minute speech that had the entire gallery of native Tennesseans, eastern Tennesseans, standing and cheering. Bryan hung his head. And in fact, Malone shamed Bryan so badly that when Darrow said, I would like to call to the stand William Jennings Bryan as an expert on the Bible, Tom Stewart objected. Ralston said, no. Well, let's see what Mr. Bryan wants to do. Mr. Bryan was hoping to rehabilitate his reputation and said, no, I'll do it. If he wants an expert on the Bible, I will do it. And didn't fare too terribly well. This is the site of the drugstore today. As you can see, there is a small piece of concrete that has this plaque. The Cumberland Presbyterian Church, if you're standing in front of this sign, that church is behind you. It is no longer a Presbyterian church, though. Everything else is gone. That's where Central High School was. The football field where John Scopes coached the Ray County team to a winning season is actually on the other side of that little white building there. And of course, there is the W.C. Bailey boarding house. Now, you see these three windows here. According to the local historians, these three windows mark John Scopes' room. And of course, this is the trial, or this is the courtroom. You can go into the courtroom today. If they're not having court, the doors are open. And actually, in the basement of the Ray County Courthouse, they have a surprisingly excellent museum dedicated to the trial. It's there based on the work of Bryan College, which is a fundamentalist Christian college founded in the wake of this trial, and obviously named for Bryan. But it is excellent. It is surprisingly good. Every late July, the folk of the city get together and have the John T. Scopes Festival. It culminates in a performance of Front Page News, a play with music, or as we call it here, a musical. Ed Larson actually said, just going to warn you, it's, this, I don't think you're going to like it. And he was right. It's a good thing my wife is here. She can back me up on this. At intermission, I was ready to go. Because I already spotted like 3 or 4 historical inconsistencies just before intermission. Fortunately, she got me to stay, and that's how we met the couple sitting next to her on her left, which were the scion of one of the founding families of Dayton, Tennessee, and his lovely wife, who is a geologist at the University of Tennessee. And not what you would call, and he accepts evolution, he has no problem with it, and he was kind of gritting his teeth through it. The family's name? Darwin. But I did not care for the way they portrayed John Scopes. John Scopes didn't walk like that, I can tell you that for nothing. And as a kind of an effete, so what, whatever. No, that's not John Scopes at all. John Scopes is a very determined man. I'm coming up on it, aren't I? 2 minutes? All right, I'll wrap it up real quick. A lot of other historical inaccuracies. If you're glutton for punishment, I highly recommend it. They really worked very hard on it, and their performances were amazing. It's just that, you know, when at the end of the play, when you have Clarence Darrow thanking God for the Bible, you gotta really draw a line there. This is of course, the courthouse today. This is the Luke Morgan House, vacant lot, and of course, the one of the only 2 state historical markers in the United States dedicated to John T. Scopes. The other, right over there. And that is where Inherit the Wind premiered in 1960. It's now a truck parking lot. You can still see the foundation of the projection house. And of course, this is where the family plot, John, Mildred, Thomas, Mary Alba, and Leela. And there's a story behind this picture, but I'm running out of time. All right. But I do want to thank everybody for coming. We'll transition, I suppose, into the Q&A here very soon. Certainly, we've got to wrap this up for television, though. But I do want to thank everybody for coming, and thank Dr. James Croppa for coming from the University of Kentucky. If you've picked up a copy of Orion Magazine, his excellent article is in there, and I highly recommend it. I caught it on Slate.com back in March and went, I know I'd like this guy. It worked out. But it is an excellent article about dealing with students who have a little bit of an issue with evolution. Is that fairly okay? And you probably recognize this guy.
He does look familiar, and I don't know.
No. This is Dr. Jerry Coyne.
Oh, God.
Yeah, teaches it, I think, at Northwestern.
Chicago.
Okay. He is the author of the book, Why Evolution is True. The Murray State University Secular Student Alliance brought him down to give a lecture about why evolution is true. And I got the chance to interview him. And I told him, did you know that John Scopes was from Paducah, Kentucky? And he's buried there. And Jerry is a very understated guy. He was really excited. He said, oh. I offered...